All right, today we're diving deep into the shadows of the 18th century to talk about the Rosicrucians. They were a secret society caught right between mysticism and real political power. And using Christopher McIntosh's book, The Rose Cross and the Age of Reason, as our guide, we're going to see that their story is a whole lot more complicated than you'd think, starting with the very image that has defined them for centuries.
For a long time, this was pretty much the standard take. I mean, you see a quote like this, and the picture is clear, right? The Rosicrucians were just these backward-looking fanatics, a weird little footnote in the super-rational age of Enlightenment. This view paints them as a bunch of charlatans and kooks fighting against progress. It's a great, dramatic image, but, maybe it's a little too simple. And yeah, that's the big question we're tackling. What if that easy label, anti-Enlightenment, is actually hiding a way more fascinating and, frankly, more conflicted reality? So let's start peeling back the layers of myth and see what strange truths were hiding inside this secret order. To really get a handle on the Rosicrucians, first, we've got to understand the world they lived in. And that world was defined by a massive clash of ideas.
So on one side, you've got the Enlightenment. This is the team captained by reason. It's all about universal human rights, a ton of optimism, and this core belief that humanity is always progressing, always getting better. But on the other side, you have the counter-Enlightenment. This team valued faith, deep tradition, and had a more pessimistic view of human nature. They believed truth wasn't universal, but was found in specific revelations from God.
For ages, this is exactly where historians stuck the Rosicrucians, firmly in that second camp, as enemies of reason. But when you actually look at what they were doing, that simple label just starts to fall apart, and a huge piece of the puzzle, a big reason for all the confusion, it all comes down to one word: alchemy. To us, that word just screams superstition, doesn't it? But to them, it was something very, very different.
And this right here, this reframes everything. For a Rosicrucian, alchemy was not just about trying to make gold. It was a kind of spiritual science. The idea came from a Gnostic worldview, this belief that our physical world is like a prison, and that a tiny divine spark of light is trapped inside everything, from rocks to plants to people. Alchemy, then, was their version of experimental physics, a hands-on way to try and release that spark and purify both the world and themselves.
And this wasn't just some theory they talked about. This was work. They called it the Great Work, and it involved these incredibly meticulous processes. For example, they'd literally go out and collect morning dew, which they believed was packed with this cosmic life force. Then, through a whole series of complex distillations, their goal was to create the legendary Philosopher's Stone, a substance that could supposedly perfect anything it touched.
Let me tell you, this was not a cheap hobby. Just to set up the lab for a single Rosicrucian group in one city, Castle, cost $156. Now, to put that into perspective, a pretty well-paid government official back then might make about $500 in an entire year. So we're not talking about a casual pastime. This was a serious, expensive, deeply committed pursuit. These guys were all in.
And just when you think you've got them pegged as anti-progress, things get even weirder. Some of the most famous figures of the German Enlightenment, or Aufklärung, like the world-renowned naturalist George Forster, he was a member. And some of their splinter groups, like one called the Asiatic Brethren, practiced a kind of religious toleration that was almost unheard of for the time. And yet, at the exact same time, you have the core of the movement putting out stuff like this. This quote comes from a mainstream Rosicrucian writer, and it preaches absolute, unquestioning obedience to kings and priests. The argument is that authority comes straight from God, and to challenge it is a sin. I mean, that sounds like it's pulled directly from the counter-Enlightenment playbook, right? But then you get this. A major offshoot, the Asiatic Brethren, was revolutionary because they welcomed Jewish members as equals. That was a policy so far ahead of its time that even most so-called enlightened groups wouldn't touch it. So, how is that possible? How can one movement be so rigidly authoritarian and, at the same time, so radically tolerant? This massive contradiction really explodes onto the world stage when the Rosicrucians get their hands on an actual king. This one moment in history is so important for understanding why that reactionary reputation stuck to them so hard.
Okay, so here's how it went down. In 1781, a small but influential group of Rosicrucians gets the heir to the Prussian throne, Frederick William II, to join their order. When he becomes king, his Rosicrucian buddies, especially this one minister named Volner, they grab the reins of power. They start issuing edicts that roll back decades of Enlightenment progress, cracking down on free thought. But, and this is key, their power was intense, but it was also super short-lived. The moment the king died in 1797, boom, they were all fired.
So for about 10 years, this one powerful clique in Prussia absolutely lived up to the stereotype. They used their political influence to fight a full-on culture war against reason and religious freedom. But it's so crucial to remember, this was one faction in one country at one specific time. This wasn't the whole, complex, contradictory Rosicrucian movement. So what are we supposed to do with all of this? How do we make sense of all these contradictions? What's the real legacy of this bizarre secret order?
Well, this brings us to a really fascinating idea, that the Rosicrucians weren't really on Team Enlightenment or Team Counter-Enlightenment. They were part of a third current. Think of it as this powerful, spiritual, esoteric stream running through European thought. It was for people who felt that the official church was spiritually dead, but that pure, cold, scientific reason wasn't giving them the answers they needed either. They were searching for a different kind of truth altogether.
So the bottom line is this. The Rosicrucians were not a monolith. They were a walking bundle of contradictions. You had hardcore political reactionaries in one corner and radical religious tolerance in another. They were driven by this deep spiritual search that looks really strange to us, but that they pursued with an almost scientific obsession. Really, they're a perfect reminder that history is messy and the past is never as simple as we'd like it to be. And that leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? In our own lives, when we're trying to make sense of the world, how often do we reach for those easy labels, the good guys and the bad guys? The story of the Rosicrucians shows us that the most interesting, the most important truths are almost never found in the black and white. They're found in those confusing, contradictory, and deeply human gray areas in between.